Okay. You ready? Let's do this. You're listening to Explore Magazine's Live the Adventure podcast. This is the podcast that delves deep into the outdoors, will inspire, inform, and get you stoked to explore. And I'm your host, David Webb. Welcome to episode 27 of Explore Magazine's Live the Adventure podcast. I'm your host, David Webb. Today we're going to talk about expeditions, journeys, adventures. Why do we do them? What is the definition of success? Is it just getting from point A to point B, or is it something else? Today my guest is Mariele Guerrero. She's a Mustang Survival Ambassador, paddler, guide, adventurer, and last summer she attempted a circumnavigation of mainland Nova Scotia on a stand-up paddleboard. Did she succeed? I'm going to let her tell you. So stay tuned for Mariele Guerrero. Mariele Guerrero, thank you so much for joining me on Explore Magazine's Live the Adventure podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks, David.
Good. Where are you calling me from today?
I'm currently calling you from Squamish.
Squamish. Okay, I thought you were somewhere else. You're right in the neighborhood. You're about an hour away from where I am. I'm in Vancouver. Same time zone and everything. Squamish, beautiful place. I wonder if you could take a second to introduce yourself to our listeners.
I am Mariele, currently working in various aspects of outdoor wilderness guiding, as well as conducting a variety of personal expeditions in various places around the world.
Wow, that's a lot in just a little. So what are you doing in Squamish right now?
Yeah, so currently in Squamish, I'm kind of in between places. So the Sea to Sky has kind of been my part-time home for the last 5 or 6 years. So right now I just finished a season canoe guiding in the north, based out of Yellowknife, and I just returned just yesterday, actually.
Oh, wow.
And then am planning on heading to Mexico shortly, down to Baja in the next couple weeks.
So how was canoeing up in the Northwest Territories? Where were you specifically in that region?
Yeah, so the company is based out of Yellowknife, but then most of my time was spent on the water. So the two big rivers that I ran this year is I ran the Lower Horton, and the Lower Horton is in the Arctic Circle, kind of northeast of the community of Inuvik, which was where we were based out of.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other river that I ran was the Keel, which is in the Mackenzies and empties out into the Mackenzie River. And then eventually we ended up in the community of Norman Wells. And then a couple smaller trips as well around Great Slave Lake.
I've actually been to the Horton before. I believe it was the Upper Horton, though. I was fly fishing on the Upper Horton. It was a shorter run where I was. It wouldn't have been much of a canoe expedition, but
what were you fishing for?
Arctic grayling at that moment in time. Yeah. many years ago. So we connected through some contacts at Mustang Survival because of a few epic expeditions that you've been on, paddling expeditions, and I wanted to talk about one in particular. But first, we just touched on you're guiding up in the Northwest Territories. You're going down to the Baja. So paddling, water. What got you started on paddling canoes and sup?
I get asked that question a lot. It's kind of turned into a long story, I guess. My introduction to paddling was growing up rowing small boats kind of around my house and around the area that I grew up.
And where was that?
In Nova Scotia on the South Shore.
Nice.
In a small area. I grew up in Dublin Shore. So yeah, it's coastal. My family has grown up kind of in an archipelago just offshore, the Lahave Islands. So my family had commercial fishing boats. And with that came dories, like small rowboats as well. Mm-hmm. My introduction to paddling was at quite a young age when I was allowed to just start paddling the dories like around the wharf to and from the nearest islands. That was kind of my introduction, and I'd say the development of my love for the water as well. And then once I got a bit older, I began to kind of explore things for myself in my own ways. First discovered sea kayaking after rowing little boats. Yeah, one thing led to another, and I found myself working as a guide for a couple outfitters in Nova Scotia as a sea kayak guide. And then one of the outfitters that I was working for also had a fleet of stand-up paddle boards. And at that point in time, I'd never really seen them. I hadn't stood on a stand-up board.
What year would that have been?
That would have been 2017. So I'd never really seen a SUP until then. But then naturally working for the outfitter, I was renting them. Like I was giving quick little tutorials on how to use them. So I started paddling the SUPs before and after work. Like if I was working in the office, I would take the SUP out in the morning, or I'd take the SUP out at the end of the day, and found it was an incredible way to connect with the environment around me. And the more I started to SUP paddle, the more I kind of saw it as a vessel for exploration, and kind of as an alternative to a sea kayak. Then by the end of that summer, my paddling intentions had switched a lot more from kayaking into stand-up boards.
So what was it about the SUP that captured your attention, your imagination over a kayak?
There's something really special, I think, about the feeling of paddling a SUP, which I think comes from kind of the technique and the engagement that's required to actually move on it. In terms of, it's a fully embodied experience. And I think through that, it's a lot easier to stay present and be present. And then as a result, like in that awareness, it's a lot easier to make observations and connections to the environment around you. As well, a SUP is diverse and comfortable. So there's lots of opportunity to kind of move around the board versus a kayak where you're always sitting down. Also, standing up gives you a great perspective of what's under the water. You're able to see a lot more of that world. And then I think once you get into paddling a little bit bigger water, or trying to do longer days on a stand-up board, I think it's enabled me to develop a much deeper sense of the movement of the water. In terms of when you're trying to move longer days, you're thinking of how you can use the wind to your advantage, how you can use the swell to your advantage. Once I started paddling more, even paddling in small wind swell, I'd start to think of every little bump as if I was paddling into a big wave, like paddling into the biggest wave of my life on every single bump I was riding. So I think the SUP has also kind of given me just a deeper awareness, and definitely a deeper sense of the micro movements of the water.
So it sounds like this passion of yours is a lot about not just the athleticism, but about the connection to the environment, and the connection to everything around you as well.
Yeah, it's taken me a few years to learn that, for sure, but that's definitely accurate. With every kind of outdoor activity that I've explored, it maybe initially started as a physical passion and as a physical outlet. As soon as I think I started doing more kind of multi-day tripping and solo trips, it becomes evident that the experience really isn't about the physical aspects at all. It's mostly about much deeper things, and that's kind of why we're driven to these spaces and to pick up these activities.
So when did you start doing expeditions?
I started when I was traveling through the Himalayas, taking some time off from my undergrad. So that would have been in 2015 to 2016.
So not that long ago, really. And when was your first solo one? Was that then?
It was also in those couple of years.
So what spurred that interest to go on a solo expedition?
So the first solo expeditions I did were actually in like hiking and mountaineering.
Okay.
And then the first solo paddling experiences I had would have been around the same timeline, in about 2017, 2018.
So that's really interesting. 2017, 2018, that's not that long ago. And then last year, you decided to take on a particularly large solo expedition. I wonder if you could tell us what you did last year.
So last year, I worked on an expedition which I called Expedition SUP Milwaukee. So it was an attempt to travel around the coastline of mainland Nova Scotia on a stand-up paddleboard.
And how far is that?
Between 1,800 and 2,000 kilometers, roughly. The section that I completed last year was about 1,200 kilometers.
1,200 kilometers on a stand-up paddleboard on a coastline that consists of the open Atlantic and the Bay of Fundy, Northumberland Strait, all these fascinating bodies of water. And you took that on roughly 3 or 4 years after doing your first solo expedition. That's quite the jump. what spurred that idea, the concept of circumnavigating the mainland Nova Scotia? What made you want to do that?
I guess that is kind of a jump. I've never really thought of it like that. But I guess first I'd like to kind of address the idea of doing it solo. We've been talking about this for the last little bit. The more I've done things alone, it seems so strange to me to conceptualize these trips as solo trips. Yes, I paddled them on the water by myself, but there's so much support that is required to complete a trip like that from the very beginning. Like people who have taught you how to paddle, people who have helped you along the way, people who have given you beta and support and gear to make all of this possible, people who are like assisting with food drops and logistics. So while the paddling itself is solo, I still find it really hard to conceptualize this trip I did last year as a solo trip.
So you don't like calling it solo trip. I totally get what you're talking about. It's an expedition. You've taken it on. You've thought of it, but there's so many people involved in it, whether they're involved in the planning, the execution, or perhaps that you just encounter along the way, maybe that it just can't be solo. So maybe the nature of it itself, it cannot be solo. Is there such thing as a solo trip? Maybe there's nothing. No, maybe there's no such thing as a solo trip. Maybe that's an ego. Maybe that's people's ego saying, there's always someone helping. Very few people would execute start to finish without the help of anyone. Maybe some people, but I don't know of anyone.
Yeah, and I guess that's an individual kind of preference, how you perceive your experience. And I don't mind calling it a solo trip by any means.
Who helped you out, and how did they help you out?
One of the biggest supporters of that trip, and really the reason it could happen, is one of my best friends, whose name is Dan. And Dan is Australian, and he was living in Nova Scotia with a kind of expired work visa. Wasn't able to go back to Australia due to COVID restrictions and regulations. Some of his purpose for that last winter and spring and part of summer that he spent in Nova Scotia was essentially working as one of my main supports on the expedition. So he was like base support. He was the person who I communicated with the whole time. He's the person who helped arrange my food drops. Just before I left for the trip, there was some hefty COVID restrictions put in place and travel restrictions put in place in Nova Scotia, which made it a lot harder to deal with logistics. So I wasn't able to put food drops across the province as I'd hoped to do beforehand. So as a result, he would meet me with my food drops as well. He was just always in constant communication. He helped a lot with the food prep and the prep that I was doing before. He did a lot of vacuum sealing and a lot of help with dehydrating. He also offered a lot of moral and emotional support. If there was days where I was struggling with things, and I'd text him on the inReach, and he was always available, kind of be there for me and support me in whatever way he could. So that's definitely the biggest person who I kind of owe gratitude to.
How much food could you carry at one time?
It would depend on the section of the route. 10 to 12 days typically.
Okay. Yeah.
But if I could get away with carrying less, of course I would.
Way to go, Dan. Big help there. But ultimately, you're the one out there paddling. So I want to circle back on the idea. You set out to go around mainland Nova Scotia. Where'd you start? Let's hear it. What was this like? What was the first few paddle strokes like when you set out and you realized, yes, I'm doing this? And where did you set out from?
So I set out from my home, or where I grew up and where I was living that winter. So from Dublin Shore on the South Shore.
And what month was that?
That was in early June. Then I traveled around the province in a counterclockwise direction.
When you're out there on your first day, what are you thinking?
The first day was intimidating, and it came with a whole range of emotions. And I think that's a lot of the beauty of being out there alone, is working through all of that and kind of taking it as it comes and letting it pass. The first day was, a lot of emotions, fear of a lot of different things, and then also excitement because I was finally doing it. And even on the first day, there was some bigger water and some bigger crossings in some of the areas I was paddling. So I was stoked to be there and to be doing that, and felt really good about it, but also scared, nervous. I
was reading your blog on the Mustang Survival site. What I would like to know about, when you go into the Atlantic and you're out in the Atlantic, what was that like?
The Atlantic is wild. It's a wild place. That's probably the best way I can come to describe it, but it's beautiful. It changes rapidly. Every day is a little bit different, and I get to see parts of the Atlantic coast in all of its many forms. And some day that looks like calm, glassy, flat water paddling. Other days that looks like swell sets that are well over my head and breakers on either side of me. And
so you're out there on a SUP by yourself. I know it's not a full solo trip, but at that moment you are by yourself. There are swells over your head. You're on the Atlantic coast. What's going through your mind at that moment in time? Are you happy? Are you scared? Are you regretful?
Honestly, at that moment in time, that exact moment, there's most of the time little going through my head. The only thing that's happening is direct engagement with the environment, and really just a full presence in my body, because that's what I feel is needed to kind of make it through and make it out of conditions like that. So at that point, I'm not really thinking about anything. I just feel deeply engaged.
Do you think that's more intense on a SUP than a kayak because of like the dynamic paddling, the way you're or would it be the same if you were out there on a kayak in a similar situation?
It's hard for me to say because I would never paddle bigger water like that in a kayak.
Why not?
It's not my comfort zone, and the SUP, there's a much deeper level of comfort for me.
Did you stay upright the whole time out in those big swells?
I did stay upright most of the time. There was a couple swims, swell sets, or small breaks that caught me off guard, as well as a couple swims on like surf launches and surf landings.
Oh, yeah.
But most of the time, I'm able to stay upright.
Where do you sleep? Where do you stay every night?
So that would depend on the coastline and where I was. So most nights I was sleeping in my tent. Additionally, another way that Dan was able to support the expedition is there's certain areas of the coastline where there's a bit more private land ownership. So it was hard to find places to sleep without squatting. So at times I would also sleep in the van. So Dan was driving my van around, and in certain sections of the coastline, he would meet me with the van and I would sleep in there.
Did you have any rest days?
I had a lot of rest days, not many planned rest days, but there was a lot of days where the weather wouldn't let me move forward.
So how long did it take you to do the Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia?
Definitely section by section is a little bit blurry, but I believe it took around 45 days.
45 days. 45 days. Wow, that's incredible. When you set out on this, what did you have an objective of time that you wanted to complete it in? Obviously, you're boxed in by the seasons to some degree, but what were you on pace? Were you more in the moment? Were you just doing it day by day? Like, how were you monitoring your progress?
Yeah, so going into the expedition, I hadn't set any specific day by day timeline. My overall objective was to circumnavigate the whole coastline kind of by the summer's end, which I'd hoped to do within 2 to 3 months. Once I was paddling, it did become evident to me that there was a lot more out of my control than I had initially realized. I've grown up there, so I'm aware of how the weather changes. I'm aware of how the Atlantic was going to look. But even with that awareness and with that in mind, like living out actual reality of that every day, yeah, it really just became evident kind of how out of control the weather and the circumstances were for paddling. So once I finished the Atlantic coast, I was a little bit behind where I would have liked to be, but I was still on a schedule where it would have been possible to circumnavigate the whole province if I was willing to paddle in, like into September and potentially even into October.
And so you complete the Atlantic coast. Where are you now?
So after the Atlantic coast, there's where the mainland meets Cape Breton Island. There's a causeway. So I went through the causeway and through the Canso Strait.
Right.
And then that brings me to the Northumberland Strait. And so it's kind of the body of water in between Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. And then at that point in time, that's where the isthmus is. So that's where Nova Scotia is joined by land to New Brunswick. So I did a vehicle portage over the land and then put in again at the top of the Shubenacadie River.
So you're going into the Bay of Fundy, and everyone listening here probably knows what the Bay of Fundy is most famous for. These incredible, mind-blowing tides that I've seen with my own eyes. So you're paddling the biggest tides in the world. How'd that go?
It's one of the most beautiful and incredible experiences on the water I've ever had.
How so?
In terms of my experience with it, there's probably a lot of factors playing into that. There's something very special about feeling the power of the tide, essentially feeling the power of gravity and feeling the power of the moon under you and having the ability to move with that and to really see it move at the velocity that it does in the Bay of Fundy. It was a really special experience.
Again, I was reading about your trip and a quote came up from you that I thought was really interesting, that at this time you said your objective-based ego disappeared. I wonder if you could explain what that means.
I definitely had a personal transitioning point while I was riding the tidal bore in the Bay of Fundy. Yeah, I guess to give you a little bit more context of the area that I was paddling at the time that I kind of had this realization. So the Shubenacadie River empties out into the Bay of Fundy, and this is kind of the most narrow part where, it's the end of the Bay of Fundy. So all of the water, when the tide rushes in, all of the water is kind of forced into this narrow channel. And then it runs up the Shubenacadie River. So the Shubenacadie River, so it's flowing out into the ocean. And then when it comes up and it creates a tidal bore, so it creates a wave, and that's kind of the initial flow into the Shuby. And then following the wave kind of comes a succession of tidal rapids. The velocity and the speed that it's moving, the tidal rapids are kind of unlike anything you'll ever paddle in terms of you're initially sometimes standing on the seafloor. You're just standing on the sand, and then you'll see the first wave go by. And then that's when we know it's time to pull the boards into the water and get ready to go. Within minutes, you'll kind of have standing waves and crazy, strange water features just build in front of you. And then they'll build and then they'll just kind of disappear as more water flows into the river. What we did while we were paddling in the Shuby River is every day we'd go wait for the tide to come in, wait for the tidal bore, paddle up the river, which we paddled to quite high. We paddled to kind of where the rapids end. So that's almost a 20-kilometer paddle with the flow of the river. And then once we get to the top, through all this incredible tidal white water, which is so much fun, then we would just pull out on the shoreline and pretty much wait for a couple more hours until the tide started ebbing. So then we would ride the same river now with the ebbing tide back down. So that was a really incredible special experience to spend about 12 hours on the water paddling up with the tide and then paddling down. So when I reached that point in the expedition, I'd initially been planning on continuing on. So I was planning on spending one day, maybe two, paddling the tidal rapids and paddling this section of the Shuby River. But then once I got there, I just had such an incredibly transformative experience, in the first couple of days of paddling it, that I was I really don't want to leave. I just want to stay here and I want to keep doing this. I want to do this day after day until I'm ready to move on. And this was deeply what I wanted. But I was oh no, I can't do that because I'm on this expedition and I'm supposed to keep moving because that's what I said I was going to do. Because if I don't keep moving, I'll be failing. And created all these stories in my mind of why I had to keep moving. And it was kind of one of those days when I was paddling the ebb tide, so paddling out of the river after a great day of paddling. And I was I don't have to keep moving. Why do I think I have to keep moving? There's nothing I have to do here. And ultimately, at the end of the day, there's no reason I have to do any of that. If I want to stay here and I want to explore and I want to connect to this environment, I should be able to do that and I should let myself do that. So that was kind of the experience of letting that objective or ego-based objective mindset kind of float away and just let myself be in the place in the way that felt right.
And so how long did you stay in that area?
About 10 days.
Is that where you ended your expedition at that point in time?
It's not where I ended it. But it is when I decided that I was no longer going to paddle the whole coastline. I was happy to kind of pull out there. I ended up paddling 4 or 5 days longer, about 100 kilometers further down the coastline.
And so when it came to an end, you decided, you know what, I feel good about this. What was going through your mind? What were the lessons learned from this expedition?
So many lessons learned from this expedition. I mean, one of the biggest ones, I think, was about vulnerability. I mean, in order to interact with those environments and in order to be out there alone, you really have to give yourself to it. There's a certain sense of purity, I guess, purity or vulnerability that's required in order to move through that environment and essentially in order to stay sane out there. So vulnerability in the sense of letting the water, letting the environment, letting yourself see yourself just as you are. And yes, so I think there's a lot of lessons learned about vulnerability kind of in many different ways on that expedition. Also in terms of myself, being vulnerable with myself about really the reasons why I was out there. And that kind of came to light at the end of the expedition.
So you found maybe a deeper truth to why you were out there? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, definitely a deeper truth
to
why I was out there.
Why were you out there ultimately? What was the real reason?
In the simplest sense, I was out there to connect with the environment, to learn from the environment and hear its stories, also to connect with myself on a deeper level.
And do you feel that was accomplished?
Absolutely accomplished.
So then it was a success.
It was a success.
These lessons that you've learned, are you experiencing paddling? Are you experiencing the outdoors differently since then all the time? Was it life-changing like that?
It was life-changing. In one hand, I guess, in the way that, not just the way I interact with wilderness spaces, I'd also say the way I interact with the world on an everyday level. And really, I think, to me, that's more of a definition of success than finishing the expedition or not, in terms of the way we really, or the way I really measure experiences like that is in the meaningful changes that creates in one's life following that experience. So it's not really about the experience itself. It's about what we carry forward and how we actually implement that. So I would say in terms of how I interact with the world in general, since that experience and kind of every little wilderness experience I have, I think I learn things from it. I give to that experience and I take things from it as well. And yeah, I think that's constantly kind of changing my perspective and changing the way I view things in the world. And I think as long as that's happening in a positive way, that's kind of my measure of success of these things that I'm doing.
The physical journey is one part of it, but it's an expedition of the mind ultimately, and the heart and the soul.
Yeah, that's a good way.
What would you have done differently?
I mean, I don't regret anything. I wouldn't look back and change that journey. In terms of future projects, future expeditions, I am trying to be a bit more loose with my objectives when I'm working on personal projects, in terms of it's very important to have a plan and be prepared. So doing that, but also balancing that with never being attached to an outcome. So always being open to my plans changing. And yeah, with expeditions, same with expeditions, just being open to the plan changing. So if I have an initial goal and an initial plan, not attaching myself to that and kind of just letting myself be open to everything that's happening around me, taking opportunities as they come rather than being fixated on an objective.
Yeah, I think that's a nice outlook to have. Something I try to keep with me, but I could probably use some work on it. Maybe I need to do a quote unquote solo expedition like yours to get my mind right. I haven't done one in a long time. A lot of our listeners and readers of Explore magazine are into canoe tripping and kayak tripping, but less so for sup journeys and stuff like that. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you outfitted yourself for the physical sense of this journey. Like, what did you wear? What did you paddle? How did you manage to go through 4 meter swells? And
So I guess that starts with the sup. So the sup that I'm using is 14 feet. It's 27 inches wide. So it's skinny and long. It's pretty fast. It has enough rocker that it can cut through or it can go over big swells. Then in terms of gear packing, it's similar to other paddle sports. The only difference is that it's much lighter weight. And much lower volume. So you're always looking at kind of how you can minimize your systems. I paddled with a 65-liter dry bag on the front of my board. So that bag sits kind of just at my feet. And then I paddled with a 35-liter bag behind me. The 35-liter bag really just carried my water and sometimes my tent as well.
Yeah. So would you describe as a minimalist form of travel then?
Compared to other paddle sports, it is pretty minimalist.
If someone's looking to get outfitted for themselves, what are your favorite? What are some of your favorite gear?
My favorite gear that I paddled with, or kind of the invaluable stuff in the expedition last year, is these certain kind of dry bags that Mustang Survival makes. They are called the Greenwater series, and the shape of them is kind of perfect for sup touring. So they're basically rectangles with zippers. They fit on the board really nice. The profile is quite low, which helps with wind resistance, which is a big thing you're looking at when you're packing your sup. Obviously, you don't want the gear to be too high because that catches a lot of wind and kind of changes the weight distribution of the board a bit. As well, the PFD that I had is so Mustang's Chimera PFD. So it's a bit smaller. It's very compact. It doesn't get in the way. And I do find, like, with the mobility of sup paddling, a lot of kind of larger PFDs, river PFDs, tend to be a bit bulky. They get in the way, like chafe your arms a little bit. Some
Light,
favorites.
slim, aerodynamic, all part of it. If I was thinking about taking my first overnight trip on a sup, what would be, say, 3 things I would need to consider that I might not be thinking about right now?
Effectively, it's this backcountry trip. So you start with the basics, like sleeping bag, tent, thermarest, or sleeping pad. And then you want to be pretty lightweight. Food, and then of course the regular safety, survival, emergency gear that you would carry with you. I guess if you're paddling on a sup, you'd need to be familiar with sup repair and sup repair kits and make sure you are effectively outfitted with those and that you know how to use everything in your repair kit properly. Another really important piece of gear is the dry bags that you're using. So that's probably something that's pretty unique to sup touring. Is having the right dry bags and having the right packing systems. And then I guess additionally, your layering systems and your clothing for supping might be slightly different than other paddle sports in terms of it is a full body experience. So it tends to be a bit more kind of higher intensity activity. So, also looking for light, breathable clothes depending on what season you're paddling in.
Did you wear a dry suit?
I did not wear a dry suit. I was wearing for the beginning of the trip, I was wearing like a 3 mil Farmer Jane wetsuit. So no sleeves, like open arms, and was usually wearing like a light sweater on top of that. And then the second half of the trip, I was just paddling tights or leggings.
So right now you're in Squamish, you're heading to Mexico. Where's your mind at? What does the future hold for you?
That's always a good question. You never know what the future holds. So the immediate future is going to Baja for a couple months. And then I'm currently kind of taking the winter off from the last kind of few years I've been working in the snow, mostly working ski patrol. I'm taking the winter off from ski patrol, planning on doing a bit of traveling, which I'm not totally sure where that will take me yet. Next summer, I'll be doing another season of guiding.
Any big solo, not solo expeditions coming up?
And there's so many places in the world to explore. So
where's your dream? Where's your dream? Where's your dream solo expedition, or not solo expedition, but where's your dream personal expedition?
I don't have one dream expedition. I have many. Currently, since I'm going to be in Baja, I'm looking at some potential routes down there, mostly downwind routes, the northerly wind that comes in the Sea of Cortez at this time of the year or over the winter months. So could make for a fun downwind route. Currently looking at possibilities there, but
anything in Canada that you have your eye on?
Of course, always. So much of it, I think, there's always ideas running through my head. I desperately want to return to Nova Scotia to continue paddling the route that I was on and finish circumnavigating the province. I'll know when the time is right for that. And as of now, the opportunity hasn't presented itself in the near future. But otherwise, I was really, really impacted by working in remote environments in the north this summer. So I'm excited to see what kind of possibilities lie up there in the future.
I look forward to following along on these journeys and seeing where they take you next. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and your mindsets and what you learned on your expedition and what you learned in your paddling career with us today.
Yeah, well, thank you for chatting with me, David.
So if you can leave our listeners with any final thought when they're going out, whether it's a hike or a cycle tour or a canoe trip, they want to get in the right mindset, what advice would you give them?
Just enjoy it. Take a minute to smell the roses, to pay gratitude to everything that's around you, to close your eyes and listen to the sounds. And when you're interacting with those spaces, try to find some intention in it and really try to find out what they mean to you.
That's great advice. I'll keep that in mind for myself too. Thanks a lot for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, David.
I love this definition of expedition success, by lessons learned. After all, Mariele wasn't mapping new ground. This was a personal journey, and only the person can define its success. Still, 1,200 kilometers on a paddleboard is pretty impressive no matter how you cut it. I hope you were inspired today. I know I was. Heck, it's November in Vancouver, and all I want to do is get in a Mustang dry suit and go for a paddle. If you want to learn more about Mariele's journey, go to mustangsurvival.ca and find their captain's blog to find her and other stories. Thanks for joining me today. I'm David Webb, and hey, live the adventure.